Whenever a game gets remade, I'm always interested in seeing what aspects of the original a developer has decided to change or add to. But most remakes are handled in-house by the same developers, or at least some individuals who were involved with the original. Not so with Demon's Souls for the PS5, which brings From Software's 2009 cult hit to the new generation of Sony consoles via Bluepoint Games. The result is a game that faithfully recreates the seminal PS3 classic's brutal gameplay while bringing its world to life in stunning detail, achieving an experience that feels familiar yet different all at once. What I mean by that is that Demon's Souls features revamped visuals and audio that give it a noticeably different tone to the original. Where the PS3 classic gave off this weird, almost uncanny vibe, the remake achieves a more traditional dark fantasy aesthetic with its more detailed environments and overtly monstrous creature designs. The change isn't necessarily bad, especially considering just how intricate the game's visuals are, but it does wind up feeling a touch more generic. Gorgeously rendered, yes, but generic nonetheless. This shift in visual tone is reinforced by a soundtrack that veers hard into epic orchestral territory, leaving behind the creepy loneliness of From Software's Demon's Souls. The remake does make use of the odd motif from the PS3 soundtrack from time to time, but otherwise the game's boss fights feature entirely new arrangements that feel decidedly more bombastic and heroic. Whether this is because the tracks are more sonically dense, or because they lean heavily on a choir that, as far as I can recall, wasn't present in the original, I'm not sure, but the tonal shift is clear regardless. That's not to say that Demon's Souls' new soundtrack is bad. In fact, I think even with this new direction, the game sounds incredible. It's just that 2009's Demon's Souls had such a distinct, unearthly quality to it, and 2020's Demon's Souls feels much safer by comparison. In other areas, however, the remake has seen some indisputable improvements. For starters, the fidelity of the game's vocal performances is far clearer across the board, and to Bluepoint's credit, the majority of it has been re-recorded using the original voice actors. Additionally, in a first for Souls games in general, characters actually have lip syncing and facial animations which are shockingly expressive. On that note, Demon's Souls features an impressive array of brand new animations across the board. On top of facial animations, there are other small additions like feminine walk cycles for player characters, but the game's new critical animations are one of the most notable improvements. Countering and backstabbing have never felt so impactful in a Souls game before, and it's honestly pretty impressive that there are not only separate animations for each weapon type, but also for wielding weapons in one hand or two. The game also makes use of a number of striking particle effects, such as the burning effect as enemies attack debris with flaming weapons, or magic attacks that feel suitably powerful thanks to bright explosions that dissipate in a really satisfying manner. But even smaller touches like the embers floating through the air in certain environments or the wispy fog that emanates from your character while in soul form make the world feel alive. But beyond simply looking brilliant, Demon's Souls on PS5 runs almost flawlessly. Besides one noticeable drop in frame rate when warping into the Prison of Hope level, the game runs at a solid 60 FPS in performance mode, and regardless of which mode you run it in, the game looks super crisp. Demon's Souls load times are also worth mentioning, as loading between levels takes a few seconds at most, respawning after death is almost instant, and minimizing downtime even further, you can simply warp between archstones instead of traveling via the Nexus every single time now. Finally, we can't talk about how the game works on the PlayStation 5 without talking about its DualSense implementation. Demon's Souls makes use of the controller's adaptive triggers in some subtle but interesting ways. For instance, when firing a bow, the game provides different levels of resistance depending on the type of bow or the weight of arrow you might be using. Much more fascinating, for me at least, is the game's use of haptic feedback, which provides a surprising layer of immersion. In my playthrough, I noticed a tangible difference between the dull strike of a club and the metallic clang of a sword on armor, and magic felt gratifying to use thanks to a gradual build-up of feedback. Maybe this is just because the DualSense is new and everything about it is kind of amazing to me, but the range of sensations that this piece of hardware can replicate are truly remarkable. The game's bold audio, gorgeous visuals, and next-gen bells and whistles would mean nothing, however, if it was all used to back up gameplay that feels over a decade old, but I think Demon's Souls manages to deliver in this regard as well. For fans of the PS3 game, Bluepoint's Demon's Souls faithfully recreates the original Souls formula that would go on to influence a decade of action RPGs. With that in mind, the game is not without some important quality of life changes which make the experience much more playable and well-rounded. For those unfamiliar, the original Demon's Souls was the progenitor of the Souls-like subgenre of RPG. It featured slower, more deliberate combat, enemies who would punish sloppy play with massive damage, and a corpse run mechanic that forced you to make your way back to your place of death to regain lost experience, at the risk of losing it all permanently if you died in transit. The remake maintains all of these elements practically unchanged. Combat is still relatively slow and deliberate, enemies still ruin your health bar if you let them, and you've still got to go pick up your souls if you die. While Bluepoint's remake doesn't make any sweeping changes to the tried and true formula, Demon's Souls does feature a handful of minor alterations that mitigate or remove some of the original's more frustrating elements. The biggest change has to be the ability to roll in 8 directions while locked on, as opposed to the original's 4. You could argue that this makes the game a little bit easier thanks to the greater sense of mobility, but I think locked cardinal direction rolling would have been far too restrictive, especially after 3 Dark Souls games that have used omnidirectional rolling. Additionally, while Bluepoint have made the decision to keep the original's item burden mechanic, which gave you a hard limit on total items you could carry, they've elected to let players send excess items to storage in the Nexus, either as they pick it up off the ground or from their inventory, whereas in the original, these items would have been lost to time if you couldn't pick them up when you found them. The developers have also decided to limit the number of each healing item that you can hold at once, in an effort to discourage simply loading up on them and waging a war of attrition against the game's toughest enemies. Personally, I appreciate the mindset behind this particular change, but I'm not sure the game goes far enough, as you can still hold a huge amount of multiple different healing items without any issue. These are the changes I found to be the most notable, and on the whole I think they effectively bring the PS3 Demon's Souls experience up to current standards. Otherwise, the game still features plenty of elements that haven't made their way to the other Souls games as of yet, and as far as I can tell, these remain largely unchanged. Chief among these aspects is the world tendency system. Demon's Souls is split up into 5 distinct worlds that are made up of 3 levels within them, and each world has a status that's affected by your actions in the game. Killing bosses or defeating black phantoms who invade your game will raise the world tendency, resulting in pure white world tendency if you don't mess it up. But it's extremely easy to mess it up, since lowering your world status to pure black simply requires that you die in body form, otherwise known as the form where you get to use your entire health bar and have the ability to summon in friends for help. Now, much like the original game, none of this is adequately explained in-game. To Bluepoint's credit, the screen where you can check the status of your world is far more readable than that of the PS3 game, but unless you know what you're looking at beforehand, the terminology and indicators are likely to mean nothing to you. This is a shame, because in terms of gameplay, the world tendency system results in minor changes in each level that make them that much more interesting to explore. Raising or lowering a world's tendency might result in the appearance of a friendly NPC, or an enemy phantom attack, or it might open up a previously locked area. Seeing how the world changes alongside your progress is really cool, but I get the sense that most players won't ever bother with it because the game doesn't convey the concept very well at all. With that said, I think Demon's Souls worlds are still a joy to explore, even without engaging in the world tendency aspect, thanks to its broader approach to map design. You still get plenty of those classic Souls-style shortcuts that reward you for gradually venturing deeper into new territory, but there are also some levels that are more linear but with a vertical twist, or even levels that function as a circuit, which manages to keep things really fresh. Fresher still is the game's approach to boss encounters, which are just as varied as they were in 2009 and have yet to be matched by other Souls games in terms of memorability on the whole. You see, while Demon's Souls does have a handful of knockdown, drag-out brawls with enemies that will push your timing and reflexes to the limit, which are great, the majority of the game's bosses have a particular gimmick or puzzle to them. The Armor Spider, for instance, functions as a standard big monster boss once you're up close and personal, but getting to that stage requires you to sprint up a tunnel, dodging fireballs and web shots, and once you're there, the boss will spew forth a river of fire to chase you back down the tunnel. Other bosses include a gigantic warrior who tracks you by sound, or a spellcaster whose challenge comes from her use of magical clones and spells that trap you in place if you touch them. While other Souls games lean heavily on traditional fights, and probably have the better traditional fights if I'm being honest, I find that the Demon's Souls approach results in encounters that feel far more special. Speaking of contrasting with the more well-known Souls games, I feel like Demon's Souls' story is a little more straightforward than the usual Souls game fare as well, while still offering plenty of gaps for players to fill in through item descriptions and environmental details. The game takes place in the kingdom of Boletaria, which has been consumed by an endless fog following the reawakening of the Old One, an immensely powerful being accompanied by an army of demons. You take the role of a foreign adventurer who has heard Boletaria's plight and braved the kingdom engulfing mists, where you must amass power from the demon's souls to lull the Old One back into its slumber. As with the games that followed its original release, the Demon's Souls remake features plenty of engrossing lore and side stories, but I do think the core quest winds up being a little more engaging than the typical vague plots of this style of game. The games are already pretty tough to crack for most people, so it's kind of nice to not have to work for the plot this time around. It's also nice that the game is still densely packed with content. Though there are only 17 bosses, each area preceding them is filled to the brim with armor, weapons, and items to collect, with a few brand new bits of gear made specifically for the remake. And if you take the time to soak in the game's atmosphere, you're likely to spend upwards of 15 hours in a single playthrough of Demon's Souls. On top of that, the game has New Game Plus in store for those who beat the final boss, and with the number of weapon types on offer, as well as how viable every build seems to feel, the prospect of running a new character through the meat grinder has never been more appealing to me. There's also the game's multiplayer element to keep folks busy, which functioned fairly well in my experience, though I can really only speak to assisting other players as I was never in body form long enough to be invaded. Honestly, part of me is just really happy to see these locations populated by other players' messages and ghosts after revisiting the PS3 Classic earlier this year, long after its servers were shut down. So, with that all said, Demon's Souls is excellent. Though the remake might lose a little of the original's uncanny charm, Demon's Souls is an expertly crafted remake. I have my own personal gripes with the game, specifically with its refusal to clarify the world tendency system at all, but it manages to tighten up the decade-old gameplay into something that doesn't feel out of place in this day and age, all with a gorgeously detailed visual style, strong if different musical efforts, and some really neat uses of the PS5's hardware. If you're a Souls fan, I cannot recommend the game highly enough, though for Demon's Souls fans in particular, I suggest checking it out with an open mind. Some things are different, but I don't personally think that's a bad thing, and the original is always there for you if you prefer it. Demon's Souls is available for PlayStation 5.